Good evening, everyone, and welcome back on this cold February night. We're pleased to have Tom again, and I think the topic for tonight is immigrant church. Looking forward to it. Take it away, Tom.
Great. Thanks so much, Sister Maria. Well, good evening, everybody. This is part 2 of our American Catholic History Telling the Story Anew mini course. And tonight, we're going to focus on the immigrant church. And this is a narrative that will likely be familiar to many of us. So much of Catholic history has been fueled by immigration, and the 19th century has come to be regarded as the era of the, quote, immigrant church. In the 100 years between 1820 and 1920, immigration would completely transform the US church and the nation as a whole. During the mid-19th century, the Irish were by far the most dominant of these Catholic newcomers. By 1850, immigrants from Ireland were a quarter of the population in cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Their presence also transformed the social profile of the US church. These new immigrants were significantly poorer than the Catholics who were already here, and they were also much more deferential to clerical leadership. Germans were the next biggest group numerically of the 19th century, settling in the so-called German Triangle, stretching from Cincinnati to Milwaukee to St. Louis and back to Cincinnati. During the late 19th and early 20th century, Catholic numbers would be bolstered by immigrants from Italy, Poland, and other European countries, as well as French-Canadian migration into New England. In that 100-year stretch, the number of US Catholics grew from 200,000 to more than 14 million. And you can sort of understand why there was a great deal of outcry about these growing number of immigrants and the Catholic presence in the United States. And so this does lead to a strong backlash of nativism and anti-Catholicism, which is going to be a topic that we'll address next week when we talk about brick and mortar Catholicism. So stay tuned for a little bit more about the anti-Catholic story. I should note that we were not always a, quote, nation of immigrants. That concept didn't really begin to emerge in US history until the late 1950s and 1960s. In 1958, Senator John F. Kennedy published a pamphlet by that title, commissioned by the Anti-Defamation League. It was later expanded into a book, but not released until after Kennedy's assassination. The phrase, a nation of immigrants, gained currency as part of the debates over immigration reform in the 1950s and 60s, which led in 1965 to the lifting of the immigrant quotas that had been put in place in 1924. The talk about the United States as a nation of immigrants was also part of the effort to promote a shared national identity in post-war America. We were all immigrants, the logic went, of course, with the exception of Native peoples, but our shared immigration status gave us a point of unity. Similarly, the idea of the Catholic Church in the US as an immigrant church didn't really catch on until rather recently. In 1975, J. Dolan, the distinguished historian of American Catholicism and founding director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame, published The Immigrant Church, New York's Irish and German Catholics, 1815 to 1865. The book sought to capture the local Catholic experience at the parish level, noting the difference between how Irish and German Catholics understood their faith and what they expected of the church. It also looked at the tensions that arose as parallel Catholic worlds developed in the antebellum city. The book reflected both the social history turn that had emerged within American history during the 1960s and 1970s, but also the currents of Vatican II, with its emphasis on the role of the laity in the life of the church. Dolan wanted to study the people in the pews rather than just the priests and the bishops. The US Church's post-Vatican II embrace of cultural diversity and the new self-understanding of itself as the immigrant church was evident in the 1976 International Eucharistic Congress held in Philadelphia. As part of that week-long event, organizers planned a series of 27 national heritage celebrations and ethnic liturgies to demonstrate the, quote, Catholicity of the Church. Masses were held in Armenian, Croatian, Polish, Hungarian, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Vietnamese, as well as masses for Hispanic, Black, and Native American Catholics. This may seem par for the course today, but it would have been quite novel and remarkable for those who had been raised in a pre-Vatican II world, where Latin liturgy dominated and Catholic culture was more of a monolith. In earlier eras, there was a lot of talk about Catholic immigrants, but not necessarily an understanding of the Church as an immigrant church. Ethnicity and immigrant diversity wasn't something to be celebrated as much as a challenge to overcome. Church leaders were concerned about preserving the faith of immigrant communities, but not necessarily about embracing all of their diverse ethnic customs and practices. Ethnic differences caused all sorts of challenges. How would these groups fit in? Could they? The earliest parishes in the United States were ethnically diverse, often out of necessity. St. Peter's in New York City, the city's first Catholic parish, had a congregation that included not just those of English ancestry, but also Spanish, French, Portuguese, Haitian, and all others who came to the port city. It was the only game in town, and so it served everybody. But as immigrant communities grew, they would seek out their own spaces. Germans were among the first to push for separate status within the American Church. In 1787, the first national parish in the United States, Holy Trinity, was established for German Catholics. And here the distinction, sort of parishes are either territorial, serving all of those within their territorial boundaries, or national or ethnic parishes serving a particular linguistic or cultural group. This became one approach to managing the immigrant church and growing diversity, giving each group its own parish. Throughout the 19th century, Germans were particularly desirous of establishing their own parishes and schools. They insisted that language preserves faith. They pushed back against Americanization efforts on the part of English-speaking priests and bishops. These tensions would persist and at times boil over. In 1891, members of the St. Raphael Society for the Protection of German Catholic Immigrants issued a memorial to Pope Leo XIII. The memorial letter was concerned about the loss of faith among German immigrants and expressed concern about Americanization efforts within the church and the church's Irish Catholic dominance. It called for separate parishes for each nationality to be administered by priests of the same nationality. It called for catechetical instruction in the mother tongue and separate parochial schools for each group. It also called for representation within the hierarchy of each nationality, not necessarily within a diocese, but within the U.S. Church as a whole. They wanted to see greater ethnic diversity among the bishops. Their concern was shared by other Catholic groups as well. Polish Catholics, whose Catholicism was an important marker of peoplehood and preserver of culture, especially after the partitions of Poland that erased the country from the map of Europe. They, for instance, also complained about the lack of Polish representation among the hierarchy, even in such cities like Buffalo and Chicago. In one petition, Poles reminded U.S. church leaders that Poles constituted 1/6 of all Catholics in the United States, at least according to their estimations. And they stated, quote, that Poles should be on equal footing with the clergymen of other nationalities in matters of occupation of the highest offices and episcopal sees of this country. Another Polish priest called for the need for polyglot bishops and complained that for any bishop to serve an ethnically diverse U.S. Catholic community and know only one language was a disgrace. Poles also complained about falling under the care of German priests. In 1879, they took a unique step in establishing their own seminary, St. Cyril and Methodius in Detroit, to train priests to serve the Polish American community. Tensions with the American hierarchy and the feeling that they were being treated as second-class citizens even led some Poles to break with Rome and establish their own separate national church, the Polish National Catholic Church, a breakaway denomination that was established in Scranton in 1904 and gained member congregations throughout the Polish belt from Pennsylvania to Milwaukee. One of the main issues was the control of parish property, with Polish congregations reluctant and unwilling to turn over the deeds of the churches that they had built to the local bishop. And given the partitions of Poland and the memory of that, the loss of the parish was seen as yet another loss of national property. In addition to the German question, there was also the so-called Italian problem. Italian immigration had its own challenges and controversies. Some of this was recently captured in the film Cabrini, if anybody had the chance to view that. It's available on Amazon for rent. It's a really wonderful film, and I highly recommend it. There was concern that the Italian immigrants would lose their faith. At the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1884, the U.S. bishops recognized the need to respond to the pastoral needs of the nation's growing number of Italian immigrants. Among those who came to minister to the growing Italian immigrant community was Mother Cabrini. She and 6 other members of her religious order, the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart, left Italy for New York in 1889. Upon arrival, they discovered that neither the Archdiocese nor the Scalabrinian Fathers, another Italian missionary group, had arranged for their accommodations. They ultimately had to find refuge with the New York Sisters of Charity, who graciously took them in. Cabrini and her sisters quickly set to work establishing an orphanage and a hospital. As the congregation expanded, they opened schools, orphanages, and hospitals in Chicago, Denver, Seattle, and other cities. Mother Cabrini would cross the ocean a remarkable 23 times between 1889 and her death in 1912, running what one historian has called a, quote, multinational religious corporation. She was canonized in 1938, and in 1950, Pope Pius XII named her the patron saint of immigrants. For all of her accomplishments, she didn't exactly get a warm welcome upon her arrival. When Archbishop Corrigan of New York suggested that she return to Italy, she responded that she had been sent to the United States by the Pope himself. So she basically defied the Archbishop to defy the Pope. The Italians were hardly considered model Catholics, at least by American Irish standards. Many in the early wave of Italian immigration were young males who came with the intent to earn money and eventually return to Italy. They were not particularly strict in their religious observances and carried with them a strong strain of anti-clericalism. As a result, they didn't rush to establish parishes and schools like the Germans and the Poles. Many of the early Italian congregations were relegated to the basements of existing churches. As the U.S. bishops noted at the Third Plenary Council back in 1884, the Italians, unlike other groups, quote, generally do not contribute anything to the building of churches or the support of priests. The bishops at that point also claimed, quote, it cannot be denied that nowhere among other Catholic groups in our midst is there such crass and supine ignorance of the faith as among the Italian immigrants. And they indirectly faulted the church in Italy for the fact that Italian immigrants, quote, have not been instructed in the fundamentals of the faith. I'm not exactly sure what they were thinking of when they made comments like that. Sort of insulting Italian Catholics and the church in Italy was hardly a way of currying favor from Vatican officials. But for all of those complaints about sort of the lack of devotion and lack of knowledge of the faith, Italian immigrants did bring with them a strong devotional culture, especially to the saints from their hometowns or local regions. Those saints accompanied them on their voyage to the New World and were given a place of honor in homes and in immigrant neighborhoods. Mutual aid societies were likewise often carried saint names. And those groups often organized festivals to honor their patrons, as seen to this day with the San Gennaro Festival in New York City's Little Italy, or similar festivals in other parts of New York City and other cities. But this Italian devotional culture was not always well understood or appreciated. Italian festa became a source of concern, even among the Italian clergy. One Italian pastor in Chicago in 1900 commented on the religious processions he witnessed, describing them as, quote, condemnable in every aspect. He noted how the parading of statues exposed our religion to irreverence and derision. He also claimed that the promoters of these external festivals were generally not practicing Catholics, and suggested that they were doing so just for the money collected. The worst part, though, was that these festivals, quote, there were neither pastors nor bishops to relegate the way of worship. The people do whatever they want to do. There is surely some truth to his remarks, given the potential for excess, but his comments reveal pressing concern about religious devotion taking place outside of parish structures and beyond clerical supervision. For his part, though, Pope Leo XIII gave his blessing to these festivals when in 1904 he approved a petition from Italians in East Harlem to have their statue of the Madonna of Mount Carmel formally enshrined in the parish church and given the honor of a coronation, a formal papal act, an act that was based on the evidence of favors granted and the popularity of the devotion. The crown that Mary received was made from gold that came from melted down rings and other jewelry donated by members of the local Italian community. And it wasn't just the Italians. Efforts to rein in popular devotions and reshape American Catholicism can also be seen in the American Southwest. One example comes from Santa Fe. The Spanish had established the city in 1610. The territory came under U.S. control with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the U.S.-Mexican War. In 1850, the Pope established a vicariate of New Mexico and appointed a French missionary priest, Jean-Baptiste Lamy, as the first vicar apostolic. Lamy had come to the U.S. only a decade earlier, in 1839. He struggled to establish order over the territory. Many of the clergy in the region refused to accept his authority, remaining loyal to their previous bishop in Durango, Mexico. Lamy also sought to rein in local confraternities, known as penitentes, that he felt operated outside of church supervision. They were known for their ascetic practices and elaborate penitential ceremonies. But these confraternities also helped keep the Catholic faith alive in communities over the generations, especially as the Spanish missionary era came to an end and Spanish missionary presence withdrew. Lamy wanted to reshape Catholic practice within the diocese. He wanted to replace Spanish folk devotions with European piety. He thought that the churches and chapels in the region were filled with, quote, distasteful images and primitive statues and paintings on wood. He wanted folk art removed and replaced with European statues and paintings. He also set out to construct a cathedral along European lines. He hired a French architect to construct a Romanesque structure that stood out among the local adobe buildings. The new cathedral was actually built around one of the city's existing churches, an adobe structure that was labeled dismantled and removed once the new church was completed. So you can think about the sort of the symbolism here. The original churches looked like the one image that you have in the upper left-hand corner, an adobe structure. And he sort of literally built his new cathedral around that existing church so that it could be continued to use for worship as the new church was being built. But it really was sort of planting a European cathedral on top of an existing church. It was an apt symbol for the transformation taking place. The new church authorities did not always embrace the religious practices of the Catholic people they encountered and worked to impose more rigor and authority. And it wasn't just Lamy. The Jesuits working in the Southwest took a similar tack. They reformed the Feast of Santiago, a popular holiday that had been customarily celebrated with horse racing and cockfights, by celebrating solemn high masses and introducing other religious services, and asserting clerical authority over the celebrations. Part of the work of creating an American church required ironing out these regional variations and creating a more uniform Catholic culture. The immigrant question would pose a challenge for church leaders in the United States throughout the 19th century. How to respond? As I mentioned, one approach was to cater to the needs of each distinct group through the formation of national parishes. Another approach was to encourage Americanization. That process would inevitably happen over time, but efforts at forced assimilation were generally met with strong resistance by immigrant groups, who insisted on preserving their own language and customs. But there was also a third way, one that transcended American or ethnic identity, and one that would prove remarkably effective at reshaping the US Church and uniting American Catholics across national and linguistic lines. Romanization. The latter half of the 19th century was a period of Romanization, an effort to promote greater Catholic unity, not just in the United States, but throughout the Catholic world, by emphasizing Roman Catholic identity and universal elements of the faith. In Ireland, these efforts were part of what historian Emmett Larkin famously described as the devotional revolution. It was an effort in the post-famine period to usher in a Catholic revival and transform the Irish into quote-unquote practicing Catholics, at least as church leaders understood Catholic practice to be. It was characterized by increased church attendance and the formalization of religious practice, including popular devotions. Faith life became more structured and disciplined. Clerical authority and oversight were strengthened. We see this systemization of devotions in the formal instructions attached to previously popular devotions. Practices were clericalized and connected more closely to the life of the parish. One example that I share with my students is an example of the scapular. I don't necessarily expect people to read all of what's on the screen, but this gives you a taste of how Catholic devotions were being more structured and formalized. So the scapular, for those of you who aren't familiar, and I'm assuming that many of you are, was a Catholic devotional item, a sacramental. It consisted of two sort of fabric squares connected by sort of cloth strands, and was worn over the shoulders. And wearers of the scapular were made promises that they would be spared from hell and that their time in purgatory would be shortened. But this particular instruction about the scapular made it very clear what to expect. In order to receive those spiritual blessings, one had to receive the scapular from a Carmelite or a priest duly authorized to enroll a person. It told the person how to wear the scapular. And it said that the name of the person had to be inscribed in the name of the sodality. It defined exactly what a scapular consisted of, and it outlined the conditions to gain the plenary indulgence. And then it was a long list of partial indulgences attached to it in this sort of older Catholic terminology. And there at the very bottom, you see that the instruction carried the imprimatur of Cardinal James Gibbons, the Archbishop of Baltimore. So there was a proper way of practicing each and every one of these devotions. Part of the effort of Romanization was also an effort to promote universal devotions, ones that belonged to the whole church, not simply tied to one particular place or culture. So we see this in the growing popularity of devotions to the Sacred Heart, to Eucharistic adoration, even things like Lord's Water, which became sort of a widespread Catholic commodity in the 19th century, was seen not as a sort of French custom, but a gift to the entire church. And as part of this Romanization was an increased emphasis on Roman Catholic identity. And the image that I have on the screen is something taken from one of the St. Joseph catechisms of a little bit later on, but it shows kind of that emphasis on the one holy Catholic apostolic church with the Vatican right there in the center of it all. As part of this Romanization, there was also an increased emphasis on the Pope, who became an increasingly central figure in the life of ordinary Catholics starting in the late 19th century. Papalism surged in 1870 when Rome was captured by the Italian army, and Pope Pius IX declared himself a prisoner. Catholics across the United States raised their voices in anger. They also raised funds to support him. The declaration of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870 further strengthened papal authority, or at least a certain image of papal authority, and bishops were very quick to announce that any decision that they made came directly from the Pope himself. In 1884, the US bishops mandated for the first time that priests were to wear the cassock and the Roman collar. These trends towards greater papal authority continued under Pope Leo XIII. In addition, he included the addition of the Leonine prayers at the end of Mass, the Hail Mary, the Hail Holy Queen, and the prayer to Saint Michael, and those were recited in the vernacular, not in Latin. They drew attention to papal spiritual authority. In these ways, historian Jim O'Toole has noted, quote, American Catholics in the immigrant church tightened the bonds of attachment between themselves and the bishop in the Bishop of Rome. In 1901, one bishop stated poetically that Catholics, quote, turn Romeward as naturally as the needle seeks the north. This papal mania was also shaped by material culture, print technology, and mass production. So you see sort of mass-produced images of the Pope that became sort of a fixture in Catholic households, the use of the Pope in advertising. So now Catholics really, for the first time in the late 19th, early 20th century, knew what the Pope looked like as an individual figure, as opposed to simply being a sort of distant spiritual leader in Europe. And the image at the bottom was a kind of a funky little popular fad of the early 20th century, stereopticon photography. Sort of people could take these images that were taken with a special camera, put them in a viewer, and it gave sort of a 3D image. And the one that's there on the screen was part of a series of a pilgrimage to the Vatican. So Americans could buy these sets of images and basically go on a tour of Rome and visit the Pope and receive, sort of visit him in sort of his papal chambers. And the image that you have is an image where the viewer at home could receive a papal blessing as well. So this really shows you how kind of this cult of the Pope helped strengthen a Roman identity. As Catherine Osborne has written, she's the one who wrote an article in American Catholic Studies about the stereopticon images. She wrote that this was part of, quote, a constellation of mass-produced modern artifacts that collectively created a feeling of personal attachment to individual popes and therefore made possible their central place in the emotional and faith lives of the modern Catholic laity. So it wasn't just about theological uniformity, but a shared Catholic culture centered around the Pope and Rome. In recent decades, scholars have come to rethink this world of Catholic devotionalism, recognizing how vibrant and important it was to the American Catholic experience. Devotions have been called the heart and soul of immigrant religion. They were popular for a number of reasons. Unlike the Mass, which was celebrated in Latin, devotions were carried out in the vernacular. They promised direct spiritual benefits. They were also highly personal, cultivating a relationship between the individual and God, or the individual and particular saints, who were seen as intercessors. They also fostered community. Devotional culture was often practiced collectively through sodalities, confraternities, and other societies. Robert Orsi reshaped the field of American Catholic history in 1985 with the publication of his now classic work, The Madonna of 115th Street, which looked at Italian immigrant Catholicism of East Harlem and the devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. It reflected a shift towards the study of lived religion, drawing on anthropology and ethnography. Catholicism, to Orsi, was not just about creeds and dogmas, but about rituals, practices, behaviors, outlooks, and the culture they created. He shifted attention from church pews to other places where Catholic life was practiced, including the home and in the streets. Since then, scholarly interest in Catholic devotional practice has only increased, calling attention not just to prayer life, but also practices like pilgrimages, athletics, and even sort of Catholic life in cyberspace as a sphere of popular religion and lived religion. Suddenly, the Italian problem offered new potential for understanding Catholic life. Orsi's work urges us to rethink where we look for Catholicism and what counts as Catholic practice. Moving ahead, the immigrant church isn't just a story of the past. Indeed, some now talk about how U.S. Catholicism is experiencing a new immigrant church, with waves of newcomers from all corners of the world: Mexico, the Philippines, Vietnam, Korea, Nigeria, Haiti, and so many other areas of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. The new wave of immigration was prompted by the immigration reforms of the 1960s, especially the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, commonly known as the Hart-Celler Act, that eliminated the immigration quotas from the 1920s. It prioritized immigration based on skill and family ties, and promoted family reunification. In the decades that followed, it resulted in a significant shift in the ethnic makeup of American immigration and the nation, especially a growing number of immigrants from the Americas and Asia. I think I missed a slide somewhere in there. It's worth noting that Catholics played an important role in advocating for immigration reform. The Church had long criticized the quota system as unjust and prejudiced. The National Catholic Welfare Conference worked to support passage of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, as did various Catholic ethnic groups, Italians being among the most prominent. The Catholic Church also played an important role in migrant resettlement. In the early 1960s, the Catholic Welfare Bureau played a crucial role in Operation Peter Pan, which resettled some 14,000 Cuban children to the United States. The key figure behind the program was Father Brian O. Walsh, an Irish immigrant himself, who had a lifelong concern for the stranger and the poor, and who later helped steer the Archdiocese of Miami's response to later migrants from Latin America and the Caribbean. In the early 1990s, with the rise of Haitian refugees, he challenged the city's Cuban community to take up the cause of their Haitian brothers and sisters. Catholic charities throughout the United States also helped with the resettlement of Vietnamese refugees after the Vietnam War, many of whom were Catholics from South Vietnam. Large numbers eventually settled in Southern California, Louisiana, and Texas, but also places like Minnesota and Pennsylvania. The image on the right is a Vietnamese family that was resettled to a suburban community outside of Philadelphia in 1975. Scholars have Scholars have certainly started to take notice of this new immigrant church. Among the lessons we need to recognize is that many of these communities have been here longer than we might think, especially Hispanic Catholics. A number of historians have begun to dig deeper into this history. To highlight just a few works. In Chicago Católico, Making Catholic Parishes Mexican, Deborah Cantor traces the history of neighborhood change in that city and how Mexican Americans have revived parish life and Catholicism in the communities they have come to call home. She carefully traces how parishes in the Pilsen neighborhood and other areas of the city, quote, became Mexican. Her Mexicans were not a colonized people like those in the Southwest, but immigrants alongside others who migrated to Chicago in search of jobs and opportunity, going back as far as the early 20th century. The earliest arrivals settled in the South Side and were ministered to by the Claretians. The Mexican population later coalesced on the near West Side around St. Francis, which became the Mexican Cathedral of Chicago. Located just a few blocks south of the famous Hull House, St. Francis was originally founded in 1853 as a German parish. In the 1940s, the new pastor, a German Claretian, made a concerted effort to reach out to the Mexican community and advocate for their needs. He even began broadcasting a weekly radio program in Spanish to serve the Mexican community. And the parish welcomed Mexican devotions and worked to extend social services to the Mexican community. As Cantor notes, it was a place where many Mexican immigrants experienced a refuge. While celebrating the Mexican presence in Chicago, Cantor's book also reveals the challenges of ethnic integration and neighborhood succession. Accommodation was not always easy. Older community members felt newcomers were taking over their parish. Clergy complained that it would take time for newcomers to, quote, accustom themselves to our way of practicing the Catholic faith. Mexicans had to petition to get images of Our Lady of Guadalupe to be placed inside local parish churches. But today, Mass is celebrated in Spanish in more than 100 Chicago area churches. And Latinos have helped to reinvigorate many parish communities. In this account of Mexicans' struggle for recognition and effort to find a church home, one hopes that European ethnic groups will see something of their own story and not a threat to the loss of their parishes. In a complementary work, Sergio Gonzalez looks at similar dynamics in his Strangers No Longer, Latino Belonging and Faith in 20th Century Wisconsin. The book moves from the 1920s on through to the sanctuary movement of the 1980s and 90s. It shows how the church worked to welcome Latino newcomers and the practices of hospitality that grounded that work. It also calls attention to the way that these Latino newcomers used religious ties and religious spaces for political mobilization and to gain social recognition. Alongside those historical works, sociologists and theologians have looked at the more recent immigrant experience. Brett Hoover, a sociologist at Loyola Marymount, published The Shared Parish, Latinos, Anglos, and the Future of U.S. Catholicism back in 2014, which looked at the challenges, but also the possibilities afforded when different groups share one parish and have to accommodate each other's needs. In her 2023 book, People Get Ready, Ritual, Solidarity, and Lived Ecclesiology in Catholic Roxbury, theologian Susan Bigelow Reynolds discusses the challenges that one parish in Boston had in coming together and forging a blended community, something that took a lot of meetings, discussions, community building, lay leadership, and intentionality. It demonstrates a new understanding of what it means to be a church community and how that took shape. For Reynolds, the development of a multi-ethnic, multi-generational, multi-what-have-you parish is an exercise in ecclesiology, an exercise of coming to a new understanding of what it means to be the church. It's very different from the parish model of the earlier immigrant generation that tended to emphasize homogeneity and uniformity. These dynamics in these case studies at the local community also play out at the national level. And we see this in sort of a shift in how the US Catholic Church nationally has responded to kind of this new immigrant wave. During the post-World War II years, many dioceses stopped establishing separate national parishes for various ethnic and linguistic groups. During the 1940s, the Archdiocese of New York, for instance, declined to establish separate parishes for the growing Puerto Rican community, choosing instead to integrate them into existing parishes, many of which were experiencing white flight to the suburbs. In many ways, this was a practical move. Immigrant communities were too diverse to have a parish for each one. If the Puerto Ricans had one, what about the Cubans? What about the Mexicans? What about the Salvadorans? And so on. There was also simply too much mobility and flux. The national parish model had worked when people considered kind of neighborhoods to be fixed and static. Church leaders also recognized that national parishes could be a barrier to evangelization. In looking at pastoral planning studies from Philadelphia in the early 1970s, I came across survey teams who reported that recent immigrants and others moving into urban neighborhoods complained that they didn't understand the history of territorial and national parishes and found it frustrating to be turned away from one parish, often the local parish, because it was reserved for Poles or Italians and were told to go to another parish in another section of the neighborhood. In 1980, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a pastoral letter that spoke of the value of cultural pluralism within the church. The goal was no longer to Americanize immigrants. A pastoral letter on Hispanic ministry issued 3 years later spoke explicitly of the need to, quote, ensure that pluralism, not assimilation and uniformity, is the guiding principle in the life of communities in both the ecclesial and secular society. This is part of a shift towards multiculturalism and multicultural ministry. The goal is not simply to preserve religious and cultural traditions among immigrant groups, but to lift up ethnic practices and diverse expressions of faith as part of our shared American Catholic experience, a gift to be shared by all. And here, this idea of kind of immigrant gifts, we can think about something like Christmas celebrations. Our American Christmas celebration is a mix of a variety of cultural practices. Christmas trees that began with German customs, nativity scenes and creches that come from Italy, Three Kings Day celebrations that are important in French and Spanish cultures. We've borrowed Christmas carols from many countries. And today we have Hispanic communities that celebrate posadas and Filipinos who have simbang gabi. All of these practices are now becoming part of our shared collective Catholic Christmas practice. We can also see it if we go to a place like the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. In the Crypt Church, you can go and see chapels dedicated to Mary of all of her different ethnic origins. And when the shrine was envisioned, it was sort of thought of each ethnic group having a chapel of their own to go to. But now all of those chapels are really something for every Catholic to experience. They're part of a shared collective immigrant Catholic experience. We should also recognize that the gifts of immigration aren't just gifts of cultural expression, but theological gifts too. Latin American Catholicism has promoted liberation theology and reminded the church of its mission to the poor and the importance of hearing the voice of God in the voices of the poor and the marginalized. Asian American Catholic theologians have been at the forefront of interreligious dialogue, especially with Eastern religions. Those who grow up as Catholic minorities have a greater understanding of what it means to dialogue, not just between Catholics and Protestants, but Catholics and members of other faiths. African Catholics demonstrate the joyfulness of the liturgy and the importance of community. So in short, immigration should not be seen as a problem, but as a gift to the church. And in some ways, these debates over how to find unity in our diversity is still being wrestled with by the church today. And here, I want to highlight sort of two recent cathedral projects, or actually three recent cathedral projects. The first is the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in Los Angeles. It was built in 2002 when the old cathedral, St. Vibiana's, was damaged in an earthquake. So there's need for a new cathedral. And this was the structure that they developed. And one of the focal points of the Cathedral of Our Lady was a series of tapestries that line the nave. They were commissioned from an artist by the name of John Nava. And these tapestries show kind of the universal church in all of its diversity. He had local members of the neighborhood pose for some of the saints that we don't know what they actually looked like. So we know what Mother Seton looked like, but we don't necessarily know what Perpetua and Felicity would have looked like. So he gathered local people to model. And, it really is an example of multiple sort of cultures coming together into a shared space. And the architectural design of the church was a modern space, something that no one immigrant group could claim. As they debated the model for the architectural style for the cathedral, they didn't want a Spanish mission church. They didn't want a European Gothic church. They wanted something that no one group could lay claim to. So this was one way of expressing diversity and coming up with a cathedral that emphasized a home for all. In contrast, we can see two cathedrals in kind of the American Southeast. In 2017, Holy Name of Jesus Cathedral was completed in Raleigh, North Carolina. And the year after, Sacred Heart Cathedral was completed in Knoxville. And these represent perhaps an emphasis on shared Roman Catholic identity as a way of responding to diversity. What was going to bind together Catholics of all stripes as one community of faith? It was going to be sort of this shared Roman identity, and you see it in these Romanesque church designs, sort of modeled, thinking of St. Peter's in Rome. And I think there was also sort of part of the emphasis here was that as they're envisioning a Catholic cathedral in these Bible Belt communities, they didn't want a modern structure, something that might be mistaken for a Protestant megachurch. They wanted something that was undeniably and immediately recognizable as Catholic. And so this was the style that they chose. So when we look at these two cathedrals from LA to Raleigh and Knoxville, we still see these efforts to think about how do we envision the church? What does the church in the United States, what does the Catholic community look like? So just a way of recapping all of this, some lessons from tonight's session. We want to keep in mind that the immigrant church is a rather new concept. It's one that we historians have applied to that earlier period, roughly from 1820 to 1920. We want to recognize the ongoing challenge of finding unity in diversity. How do we visualize who we are as a church? So this isn't just about history, but it's about ecclesiology. And we see a shift over the course of the 20th century from an emphasis on establishing ethnic parishes to having a multicultural church, to having cultural diversity within parish communities. We want to appreciate the gifts that immigrant communities bring to the church, both cultural but also theological. And we want to make sure that welcoming newcomers is central to the American Catholic experience and our understanding of what we are called to do and called to be as a church. So thank you very much. With that, I'm happy to open up the session to questions and conversation. I will stop sharing my screen and invite everybody to put their comments into the Q&A.
Tom, can you see the Q&A yourself?
I can.
Okay, do you want to take this one? We're not all, you see that?
I do. Give me 1 second to read it.
Okay.
We're not all English, just in case somebody at home can't see the question, it's good to repeat it. We're not all non-English speakers looked down. There's folk Catholicism within Italy, Germany, Irish, French, Spanish, in many communities. Were Italians really singled out for folk Catholicism? And here I would say no. I mean, they just became kind of the most visible group that was sort of the target of some of this sort of clerical concern. And I hope that, kind of the contrast between the Italians and sort of Mexican Americans in the American Southwest shows that these concerns about extra ecclesial practices were shared. And I think that's part of it too. It's not just the folk customs, it's the fact that so much of this devotional life and Catholic life took place outside of church structures. So part of that devotional revolution and the Romanization was to sort of tie those devotions to the life of the parish so that you would celebrate them within church spaces. And so that the spiritual blessings that would be promised by performing devotions would be connected to attending Mass, going to confession. So more closely knitting it to the sacramental life of the church.
And if anybody would like to raise their hand and ask a question, please do that. I have a little question. You talked about shared immigration status as a source of unity at some point in the American church. I mean, is that what happened to that shared immigration status as a source of unity? I mean, do you still see that, Tom, or what's happened in American society that do we have too many people who've been here too long so that the immigrants are not seen as a flood of people coming in and sharing it? They're just interlopers. Can you comment on that a minute?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we all look in our families, eventually we do trace our lineage back. Again, with the exception of Native Americans, we all trace our heritage back somewhere, whether it's first generation, second generation, or some mixture of those. Part of what happened during that period in the 1960s and 1970s, I think part of it too was shaped by kind of like historians talk about kind of like a white ethnic revival, kind of the grandchildren of immigrants suddenly became interested in their roots. And by the 80s, you had sort of a mini-series like Roots that talked about not just European immigrant experiences, but African experiences, finding one's roots. And we see this in the PBS series I'm forgetting what the name exactly, but again, finding your roots. So part of that continues. I think some of this, at least in the politicized version, gets overshadowed in recent debates over the distinction that people try and make between legal immigration and illegal immigration, that now it's about your documented status. And, it's a little bit of a kind of a red herring in all of this, because when you look back to earlier periods, the Ellis Island generation, there really was no such thing as illegal immigration. If you could get a ticket on a transatlantic steamer and show up in Ellis Island, you were basically here. Very few people were turned away, and nobody was asking for their kind of official, sort of immigrant papers. So now this is a way for some to make that distinction. But I think it's incumbent upon us to keep that in mind. And in many ways, sort of looking at our church buildings themselves reminds us of our sort of shared immigrant experience, at least sort of here in the Northeast, where so many parishes have their roots in ethnic communities.
We have another comment here, and it's from Jean Bruce. Curious as there was an anti-modernization movement in Rome and bulls against Americanization, at the same time that there was almost a commodification or commercialization of the Pope, almost an implicit imprimatur on a product.
Yeah, and so I skipped over some of this more technical and complicated history, but becomes known as sort of the Americanization crisis of the late 19th century. That was part of also just sort of a general Catholic anti-modernism, kind of as the modern world was developing, the Catholic Church sort of dug in its heels and romanticized an earlier medieval past. So anything sort of new and innovative was to be condemned. And this connected to sort of like the resurgence of medieval thought, the elevation of Aquinas and Thomistic philosophy as the official philosophy of the Church. So the United States, in the eyes of Rome, became sort of a model for modern excess. And so they condemned this heresy of Americanism, which is different from kind of the Americanization efforts of language and things like that. But they condemned Americanism. And so in some ways, they weren't sure what they were condemning other than things that were new. But that also kind of played into this emphasis on papal authority and sort of always looking to Rome to get marching orders. And so bishops tried to really sort of double down on uniformity within kind of Catholic practice. Seminaries became kind of a crucial test ground for some of these modernization and Americanization debates, because that was a sphere that bishops could control, wanting to make sure that the young seminarians who were coming from Italian, Polish, German, Irish backgrounds would all sort of come out the same, kind of a cookie cutter model of clerical formation.
Mm.
So yes, kind of a lot of interesting dynamics there work, but I really think it's sort of interesting how the Pope becomes such a cultural icon during that period.
I can't see you, but if you raise your hand, I think Matthew can focus on you and give you a heads up so you can speak. There's a Deborah Cantner says, I recommend the 1950 novel, The Cardinal by Henry Morton Robinson, good on the different ethnic groups in the Boston Archdiocese and good the push for papal authority.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
I
you.
will admit that I've never read the novel, but thank you for the recommendation.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, Tom, while you were talking, I was thinking of my own upbringing. I My mom was from a place up in Massachusetts where if you were Italian, you went to Sacred Heart. If you were Irish, you went to St. Mary's.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't know it at the time that there were Irish people over there and Italian people over there. You were just with your own kind of people. But I remember in the 60s, and there might be some sisters on this screen who were there too. I was from a parish where the Puerto Ricans arrived, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I think in Brooklyn, the same thing happened as in New York. We weren't going to have an ethnic church for the Puerto Ricans. But what I do remember is that there was an upper church and a lower church, and the
Mm-hmm.
Puerto Ricans had to go to mass in the lower basement church, which was ugly, and bereft of anything beautiful or architecturally or liturgically beautiful. And like all the white people were upstairs in the upper church. So these things are not foreign from our own experience, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, do you believe that the revival of Catholicism in the United States is going to be the work of the immigrant church? Do you see it coming from any place other than the immigrant church?
I don't want to say that it's exclusively the immigrant church, but certainly this is part of the story of vocations, kind of who is sort of entering the seminary, who is sort of filling convents. those are often immigrant communities, so sort of Vietnamese vocations, especially rich in for places like Southern California, but also sort of lay involvement. There it's a little bit harder to say it's exclusively immigrant. Some of this will depend on geography. But I think part of it too is, with the issue of just sort of mixing, it becomes harder and harder to maintain any sort of semblance of ethnic exclusivity. Sort of you mentioned sort of the divide between whites and sort of Spanish speaking. But even kind of earlier on, I remember like my Polish Catholic grade school, I couldn't quite figure out why, some of my classmates had last names like Bruno. Well, it's because, the father may have been Italian, but the mother was sort of Polish and was going to make sure that the children were going to go to the Polish Catholic. And so sometimes sort of policing those boundaries as families become mixed and blended became sort of increasingly difficult. So you can understand sort of why the church has sort of moved away from kind of the purely ethnic model. But now these issues over shared parishes are certainly sort of new sort of battlegrounds within Catholic parish life when you have to negotiate space and times. Who's going to have mass at sort of the prime time on Sundays? Who's going to have the earlier vigil mass? Who's going to have the later vigil mass? And those become difficult because neither group wants to kind of sort of sacrifice their preferences to all of that. And so you certainly will see that. And I think it's the other place that these challenges now play up, going back to the issue of vocations, is the tension between kind of American congregations and foreign missionary priests who have often been recruited to sort of fill the gaps of the clerical shortage. And it's one thing to have sort of foreign-born priests here in the Archdiocese of Newark, where I am, or the Diocese of Brooklyn or Rockville Center, where we're accustomed to seeing ethnic diversity. But when these missionary priests are sent to places like Upper Michigan, where they're not necessarily attached to a Catholic immigrant community themselves, it's awkward for the receiving local community, and it's also difficult for the priest himself, who doesn't have a larger community of sort of fellow immigrants to sort of lean upon to help make that transition. So these are going to be sort of the new challenges of the immigrant church. Back in the earlier days, there was demand for each group wanting to have its own clergy. How do we share not just church spaces, but how do we share clergy?
Right. I think Deborah Cantor has her hand up. Matthew, do you want to unmute her? Bring her on.
Hello.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi, thanks. This has been a really great conversation. I wanted to talk a little bit about this issue of inclusivity. Often we think about this on the level of what's going on in a parish where maybe multiple linguistic groups are sharing spaces and festivals and languages at masses. I've been thinking, I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm about an hour from Detroit and a couple hours from Grand Rapids, and I pay attention to both places. And I think there's an interesting thing of when dioceses include people beyond the parish. So I'm thinking about issues of inclusivity. And I was watching a beautiful Epiphany Mass from the Cathedral of Grand Rapids 2 years ago. And for the Epiphany Mass, they invited in the Mexican community, who are, a lot of them are indigenous. And they got to bring up, they brought their band playing indigenous style music from Oaxaca, Mexico. They had corn and fruit and sugarcane up on the altar. And I thought, this is the Cathedral of Grand Rapids. Like, this is kind of amazing. By contrast, what I'm seeing in Detroit, clearly, if you're going to talk about growth of Catholic populations in the city of Detroit, that is with Hispanic people. but I don't see the cathedral as a place that's going out of its way to be inclusive. They've recently been having days dedicated to relics, like for example, for All Souls, All Saints. And do they put together publicity in Spanish, inviting people to come from Southwest Detroit? No, they don't. Do people from Southwest Detroit go? No, they don't. I think that they see the cathedral as like, it's not their space. And, this is maybe 3 miles away. It just seems like there's really a missed opportunity going on. And it's so interesting to see how this is playing out in different patterns in so many dioceses. Just wanted to share that.
Good point.
And so much, as those comments reflect, so much of this does depend on kind of the local diocese, sort of not just Episcopal leadership, but also sort of local parish leaders, local parish communities. And it can be difficult to sort of have the cultural competency to minister to these different groups. Whether it's the music minister having to choose the music for a liturgy or kind of a diocesan liturgical planner. But I would hope that it becomes more than just sort of a one-off, we'll have a special sort of celebration of ethnic diversity liturgy once a year where we gather each group and kind of parade them through. It's very different to do that ongoing work of sort of including them in the full life of the local church. And I think part of the challenge too is now going to be sort of one of the Q&A was sort of like, what do I predict for the future? Historians are bad at predicting the future, but I can't help but thinking in light of all of the issues of sort of immigration crackdowns and raids and things like that. This is going to pose a challenge because it's very hard to minister to an invisible community. It's hard to minister to a community that does not want to kind of be found, that may fear going to the church, registering with a parish. So these become sort of these political struggles affect our life of faith as Catholic parish communities.
That's a great point. Great point, Tom. Well, it is 8:09. Anybody else have any other question? I think you took the one in the Q&A. Is that right?
Yeah, sort of thinking a little bit about the future. I mean, I think it's only going to be increasingly diverse, I'm sort of in a diocese like Los Angeles, I think Mass is celebrated in something like 40 different languages every weekend. You will have increasing shared parishes. There's one parish in Philadelphia that sort of really has promoted itself as sort of a home for immigrant diversity that has Mass in English, Spanish, but also Indonesian. So sometimes some of these parishes they're not officially national parishes, but they offer they sort of serve as magnets if they're the only parish in a diocese that has Mass in Indonesian or some of these sort of less common languages. So there's that function, but there are some immigrant groups like the Vietnamese in Southern California and Texas that have pushed for their own parishes simply because they have the numbers to do so. But yeah, sort of the diversity is going to be present with us, but so is Americanization. Slowly, the children and grandchildren of immigrants will sort of blend into and kind of the wider American church and be more Americanized. So yes, that is kind of our shared future. And I think we should sort of find hope in that as sort of shared gifts.
Okay. Well, it's 8:11, almost time to wrap it up. We always try to wrap it up with some kind of reflection. Today, Netanyahu is in Washington, D.C., and it's kind of interesting that Trump, who doesn't want immigrants in our country, is ready to dispose of the Gazans to Jordan and to Egypt and make them immigrant populations in somebody else's country. So the world is filled with irony and incredible goings on right now. So maybe you could just end tonight by praying for divine light and guidance on world leaders, especially on Mr. Netanyahu and President Trump, because the Gazan people are not people. They are people, and they are God's people, and they need to be loved, protected, respected, cared for, and their dignity and their safety needs to be protected. So, Jesus, come, bring the light of your spirit, enlighten and ennoble the minds of our leaders to do what is right and just, so that all people can have the shalom, the well-being that you willed for your creation. Amen. Thanks, Tom. So give us a preview. Next week's class is what?
Yeah, so next week we're going to talk about brick and mortar Catholicism, and thinking about kind of the role of Catholic institutions and Catholic institutional presence. Catholic sisters, women religious, will certainly get a shout out as part of the builders of these Catholic institutions. So I'm going to draw a little bit on some of my research on the history of St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City.
Oh, wonderful. And I think that'll be interesting for many religious who participate, because as we see our institutions that were so numerous and so great begin to fade away, it's good to remember the contribution that sisters made. So good night, Tom. Thank you again. And good night, everyone, for joining us. See you next week, Tuesday. That would be the 11th of February, right? Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes. Bring your Lord's water. Good night, everybody. Good night, Tom.
Good night.
Yeah.